Times Radio Breakfast with Chloe Tilley and Callum MacDonald.
Good morning to you. It's 8:45 on Saturday morning. Now, it's 10 years to the day since Margaret Thatcher died. As Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, she was, of course, a divisive figure, but continues to be a touchstone for modern-day conservatism. Many a politician has attempted to invoke her sense of determination, perhaps best illustrated in this famous moment.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
So 10 years then since the death of Margaret Thatcher, but does Thatcherism live on? Let's speak to Albie Amankona, Conservative political commentator with Young Voices UK and co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism. Morning, Albie.
Good morning, Callum.
Also with us, James Cowling from Next Gen Tories. Hello, James.
Good morning.
Good to have you both with us. And of course, you can have your say, text 87222 and start your message with the word Times. When I say Thatcherism, Albie, what do you think of?
I think of a woman who was a complete pioneer, not just economically, but also socially. I think what a lot of people think about when they think about Thatcher is they think about tax cuts, they think about deregulation, they think about the mines closing. People don't actually think about the fact that she was one of the only Tory MPs in 1967 to vote in favour of decriminalising homosexuality. They don't think about the fact that actually she was one of the first global leaders to talk about the threat of climate change. And she was, of course, one of the first female leaders in the modern world. So people often think about her economic legacy, but they don't necessarily think about her social legacy.
That's interesting. James, what about you? Same question. What is Thatcherism to you?
Absolutely. I think I probably do think about the economic legacy. I think that's probably what most people think of. Obviously, she reformed the financial services economy that we have and really developed the post-war economy. And I think that's something that stuck going into the Blair years and the New Labour years. I would say the legacy is that if you look to the leadership race between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, both of them tried to invoke the spirit of Thatcher. So in the Conservative Party, I think her instinct and being able to claim her mantle is something that is really important and does hold sway with Conservative voters. If you can say Thatcher would have done X, Y or Z, often people try and do that.
Do you think at least part of that, though, is because of perhaps some sort of idealism around Thatcher, that she was determined, yes, she got things done, yes, she was electorally successful, and is that where it stops? That actually there is a kind of forgetfulness around things like privatising state-owned industries, like the huge sale of council housing, for example. Lots of these things, the negative effects of which are still felt today.
I don't think there's a forgetfulness, and I don't think that it's a negative effect. There's an only negative effect to those things that you mentioned, with the sale of council houses and with the privatisation of industry. She gave ordinary people a stake in the economy. She allowed people in council homes to buy their own homes. She allowed people to buy shares in companies. She gave ordinary people a stake in the economy, and that's something which has still got a legacy today. Have there been negative effects? Yes. Should we be building more homes? Yes, but those policies in isolation, I didn't think were bad. I think what's happened since those policies is political decisions that, in my opinion, have been made incorrectly.
James, that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's the woman, there's Margaret Thatcher, and then there's what she did. And I wonder which is the most sort of dominant memory. Is it around her and her style and what she did and her determination, or, as we're talking about, some of these policies? I noted this in terms of the water issues and the privatising of the water industry, I suppose. This observation that over the sort of 30 years, water companies spent £123 billion on maintenance and infrastructure, and have taken out £57 billion, almost half as much in dividends. And the Times at the moment is leading its Clean It Up water campaign. We're all aware of the issues with our water provision and sewerage leaking into rivers and beaches and whatnot. And when you put those two numbers side by side, is that a Thatcher legacy?
I don't think so. I think that's more to do with, obviously, lots of industries were privatised during that time. But actually, if we look back, most of those public services weren't working particularly well. And really, if that was under the remit of a minister and they would have other spending commitments that they would have to make, other things pulling on demand for spending like the NHS and pensions, would we be getting the same investment? I don't know whether we necessarily would. What I would say on Thatcherism is that often politicians do a post hoc rationalisation of whatever they want to be the conclusion of what is Thatcherism. So if they want to cut taxes, well, that's what Thatcher would have done. If they wanted to do green policies, Thatcher was really an environmentalist. And I think the danger of doing that is we think about individual policies such as privatisation, and we don't think about what made her successful was her approach, her strategy. So instead of talking about the individual policies that she promoted, which were only relevant for that particular time, we should try to adopt the mindset of what type of strategies did she use? So, as Albie mentioned, popular capitalism and extending the stake in capitalism to people who weren't naturally predisposed to voting Conservative or didn't feel like they had a stake in Conservative society. I think that's something she did particularly well. And that's something we could try to do now. So I think the most obvious example is young people not being able to afford a home.
Yeah.
Extending home ownership to younger people would help them feel like they have a stake in a capitalist society. So I think the more powerful thing to do is think about the type of strategies that she would have thought through and what mindset that someone like Thatcher would have now.
Is there an argument here, Albie, just on the economic side of things, that in her privatising of things like the British National Oil Corporation and BP, if they had been kept in public ownership, that actually the UK would be, and the government particularly, would be massively wealthy? We would have a sovereign wealth fund like Norway, that actually the privatising of this took money out of public hands, fundamentally.
Look, I think it's very easy to look back 30 or 40 years on and say we would have had X if Y didn't happen. We don't know what would have happened if we didn't privatise oil and gas. We have a situation now where we have a thriving energy industry in the United Kingdom, and it could be more thriving, actually, in my opinion, if it was less regulated and we allowed the energy companies to take advantage of the fact that we need to be building more wind turbines on land, for example. So we can look back at her policies and say, oh, well, it would be so much better if this didn't happen. But actually, I think it's more important, as James was saying, to think about how Thatcher would think about the problems that we have today and what solutions and policies would she implement for us to solve those problems.
Interesting. Somebody gets in touch to suggest that Thatcher fomented Scottish independence by imposing the poll tax there first. James?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, there's perhaps an argument that as industries wound down, that there should have been something to replace that. But actually, the poll tax is one example. People often refer to, the closure of the pits. Labour closed more pits than the Conservatives did. So it's more about there was a natural trend of the economy winding down, and Thatcher simply allowed that to happen as opposed to propping up economies that weren't particularly working. Yes, I think there is an argument that there should have been more investment after that when we had a boom of the economy. But to say there are things that we could have done in Scotland and the North East to preserve some of those economies, they weren't necessarily working particularly well. They at one point, for example, the pits were costing nearly as much as the Department of Education to support them. So I think there's sometimes a bit of a rose-tinted view on what could have been if Thatcherism hadn't happened. And actually, I think her legacy is one of being quite practical and looking at problems as they were and making sure that the economy could work.
Just a concluding thought from both of you. When you look at Conservatives today, who embodies Thatcherism for you? If indeed anyone does.
I don't think that is a necessarily helpful question. You will get every Conservative MP trying to say, oh, Margaret Thatcher would have done this, or I'm invoking Margaret Thatcher with Liz Truss's tax cuts, or with Rishi Sunak's more stable approach to the economy. I don't think it's helpful to be looking around at Tory MPs and saying, which one is Thatcher? I think it's more helpful to think about what would Thatcher do in today's situation? And is the Conservative government taking a particularly Thatcherist approach to things? I think that's a question which is up in the air.
Yeah, I think if you asked a number of Tory MPs, most of them would probably say me. Not me personally, as in them. But really, I don't think we live in a Thatcherite economy right now. So we have growing demands on the state. Realistically, are we going to reduce demands for the NHS or for pensions, things like that, public spending? That is a difficult sell. So actually, I think we need to look at the economy as it is today and think about taxes seem to be remaining high. Can we cut them in the future as we get more growth? Yes, hopefully. But we privatised most industry. So
Really interesting conversation. Thank you both. Thanks for being here. Albie Amankona, Conservative political commentator, and James Cowling from Next Gen Tories.